During his stay in Vienna, he was a witness of Anschluss of Austria.
Yes.
Was it a significant experience for him?
It was a horrific experience for him. He realized that something horrible was going to happen, and Weingartner himself was dismissed from the academy. I think it was probably because he tried to defend the Jewish members of his orchestra. I don't know I ought to find out the exact history of why Weingartner was dismissed, but then some Hitlerite musician was put in to run the composition side or the conducting side of the Vienna, the conducting side it was, of the Vienna Academy. And André didn't want to learn with this man, and Weingartner said, well, you should, because you have to get your certificate. And André said, no, I'm not going to stay. And he went briefly back to Poland, but then he followed Weingartner, who went to Paris. And while he was in Paris, he didn't actually study with Weingartner anymore, though they remained in contact. And Weingartner was very helpful to him. But he went to see the great expert on Debussy and Ravel, called Philippe Gaubert. And Philippe Gaubert was a very, very great expert on that music, on the turn of the century in France, with the Fauré and Ravel and Debussy. And he gave André Panufnik lessons, and he was so impressed by this young man that he wouldn't accept any money. And he said, it was a pleasure to teach you. So André Panufnik was very fortunate, in fact, because he studied with a great Weingartner in Vienna, and he studied French music with Philippe Gaubert. And then he went on to England, and he didn't study with anybody. He just went to every concert he possibly could and just watched conductors and listened to music. But then there was signs that war was going to come. It was not a complete surprise, the invasion of Poland. It was, nobody knew, but everybody knew that Hitler was getting very dangerous. And he returned to Poland because he felt he ought to look after his old parents. And Weingartner told him he shouldn't go because he should stay away from Eastern Europe because it was endangered. And he went because he felt a sense of family duty. So he was in Warsaw throughout the war.
Mm-hmm. What was his look like during the war?
It was horrific. At the beginning of the war, he started to write a heroic overture because he had heard how the Poles were standing up to the German army, and but it was an unrealistic stance, unfortunately. I mean, I'm told that the cavalry were trying to charge tanks with on horseback with a spear. You know, it was not, and there was propaganda that the German tanks were made of cardboard. I mean, it was completely unrealistic. He was writing his heroic overture, and gradually the Germans were advancing on Warsaw. And he realized that the disaster was coming, and he stopped writing heroic overture. He went back to it years later, because he always planned his works complete before he started them, and always knew where they were going. He didn't just write and see where he got to. He always had a sort of plan in his head. Luckily, he held the plan in his head of heroic overture, and actually it's going to be performed in London in about 6 weeks' time by Łukasz Borowicz, so we shall hear it again. But his life in the war, it was a matter of trying to survive, and for men in particular under the Nazis it was extremely difficult to survive, because they would just sometimes load people into a lorry and take them off and probably shoot them or I mean, you didn't have to be Jewish to be put into Auschwitz. His cousin Anthony died in Auschwitz. His brother died actually killed by a bomb, but his brave brother was radio operator for the underground and used to smuggle food into the ghetto and do all sorts of very dangerous things. Andrzej for a while stood on rooftops putting out small fires from bombs, but I think that he stopped doing that after a while. I think everybody stopped doing that. It didn't really help. But it was very, very difficult time. You probably know that he played for 3.5 years in cafes, in artistic cafes. People in the West don't know what artistic cafes are, but during the war, that was the only way you could hear music. And there were other cafes with actors and artists, painters, and somehow a sense of culture was continued only through these cafes, because concerts were banned, because you weren't allowed to gather in groups. The Nazis wouldn't allow large groups of people. So they had one or two, I think they had 2 underground concerts, very dangerous, where people arrived in 1s and 2s and then listened to the concert and then left in 1s and 2s so that the Nazis never saw a crowd coming or going to these secret concerts. But it was very, very dangerous. I mean, he was lucky to survive.
How did your husband recall friendship with Witold Lutosławski?
Well, they were very good friends.
During that times, right?
Yes, and thereafter too. They graduated at the same time. There was a laureates concert with 3 people who became really famous. It was my husband was conducting his own music. Lutosławski graduated as a pianist, and so he was playing piano. Mm-hmm. And then he went back and studied composition in more detail afterwards. When Andrzej was going to Vienna, he was continuing his studies. And there was famous Marcusinski, who became one of the world's great Chopin players, and because of politics and everything, moved to South America, and didn't play in Poland after things got difficult, politically. But he was a wonderful pianist. Mm-hmm. So there was a year of incredible talent emerging from the conservatoire.
What happened to your husband during the Warsaw Uprising?
He left everything behind because just before, in fact, his mother was extremely ill, and there was tremendous unrest and fear and worry in Warsaw, and he took his mother to the country and to try and look after her, because she was very sick already, and so he was not actually in Warsaw. But before that, before he left, which was just before the uprising, he had been approached by the underground to write some resistance music, and there was he was given words, but he was not allowed to know the identity of the man who wrote the words, and the man who wrote the words was never told the name of the composer. It was years later that they discovered who they were, because it had to be very, very secret unless one of them got caught and got tortured, so they couldn't betray each other. It was a very, very careful system of not knowing the name or proper identity of people you worked with when you were doing things for the underground. So he wrote several resistance songs, and 4 of them have survived, and Warszawskie Dzieci is still sung today, and I believe children at school in Warsaw all learn it, but everybody knows the tune. I have a lovely Polish lady who helps me in the house at home, and I said, "Do you know Warszawskie Dzieci?" And she said, "No." And then I sang the tune to her, and she said, "Oh yes." And it just caught people's imagination, and I gather, you know, it's a sort of symbol of that period. And he was, it was quite dangerous to write these things, but obviously this is what he could do. That he was not a fighter by nature, but this is his way of helping, I think, in any way he could, the resistance.
And what happened to his works? I mean, the scores during the uprising?
Well, he left them behind in his flat he had then, and when he came back into Warsaw, it was horrific ruin, and everything was practically laid flat, as I'm sure you all know, but by some miracle, the building with his flat in was still standing. So he went into it and he knocked on the door of where his flat had been, and there was some woman who'd moved in there because she had nowhere else to go. And he said, he was not nasty about her being in his flat at all, because he was never nasty to anybody. But he asked what had happened to his music, and she said she just didn't know what he meant. She was a very ignorant woman. And he said, well, paper, you know, with dots and lines on it. And she said, oh, that rubbish, yes, I burnt that. And so he lost every single note of music that he had written. He lost 2 symphonies. He lost the psalm he played. He lost even his piano trio, which was the first work that had been recognized as important piece of music. He lost everything. He just lost all his music. He lost with Lutosławski. He wrote a lot. They took orchestral music, and in order so people could hear works they loved, they wrote two piano versions, which they played in this cafe, which had 2 pianos, of quite a lot of classical orchestral works. And Lutosławski also had to escape Warsaw, and he had only a little truck, a little barrow that he was taking, and he told me once, he said, I couldn't take Andrzej's music as well as mine, and I hardly took any of mine, but it was just impossible. You know, we didn't know if we had any future, and I just wanted to save a few things. And he said to me, is Andrzej angry with me? I remember him asking me this, and I said, no, I mean, you know, everybody left things behind. How
did he reminisce this experience, losing everything?
Well, with sorrow, deep sorrow, because it's like losing your children if you're a composer. Not quite like losing your children, but it is. Was it
difficult to start from the beginning once again?
Well, it wasn't possible for a while because then there was nowhere to live in Warsaw, and he took his sick mother and his then also wounded father, and his brother was dead, and his sister-in-law was dead, and there was a beautiful and adorable niece, little Eva. He was busy looking after their survival and sort of selling, I think, you know, almost selling his socks. It was almost impossible. They went to the Tatra Mountains, and they survived just about, but it was very difficult to get food. And then gradually the Russians arrived and took over from the Germans, and there was a realization this was not going to be so very much better. But it was, for a while it was better, because the Russians were so busy securing the country that people like composers could write whatever music they liked, because nobody was taking any notice. And Andrzej Panufnik, his first thought was, well, people need music.